Welcome to Revenge Stories 101. Today's story isn't just about a divorce, it's about the art of the long game. It's about a woman who sat in the shadows of a predatory empire for 15 years, documenting every brick of a lie until she had enough to bury the man who built it. This is Elena Thorne's masterclass in retribution. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air right before a skyscraper collapses. I sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing a navy dress that cost less than one of Julian's silk ties. To anyone watching, I looked like a woman who had already lost, a discarded relic of a 15-year marriage, waiting for the final blow. Across the mahogany table, Julian Sterling looked like a king about to sign a peace treaty on his own terms. He was leaning back, his charcoal Armani suit perfectly tailored, his tanned face radiant with the smug, self-satisfied glow of a man who thought he had won everything. He didn't just want the divorce, he wanted the humiliation. He wanted the Sterling Crest Empire, the Lakeshore Drive penthouse, the prestige, and the freedom, all while leaving me with the scraps. His lawyer, a shark named Arthur Vance, leaned in. He whispered 5 words into Julian's ear. Just 5. In an instant, the world shifted. I watched the color drain from Julian's face. It wasn't a slow fade, it was a total whiteout. His skin went the color of cheap office paper. His hands, which had been so steady as he reached for his gold-plated fountain pen, began to tremble. The settlement papers, the ones he had been so eager to sign to get this over with, shook in his grip like dry leaves in a Chicago gale. And me? For the first time in 3 agonizing years, I let a smile touch my lips. Not a big, triumphant grin, just a small, sharp edge. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You can't appreciate the ending of a tragedy unless you understand how the scaffolding was built. You need to understand how a woman everyone dismissed as the quiet wife became the architect of Julian Sterling's ruin. My name is Elena Thorne. I'm 34 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was the invisible engine behind the Sterling name. 15 years of marriage. That's longer than most tech startups last, longer than some modern borders have existed, and certainly longer than my sanity should have held out. But I'm a thorn. We don't break. We just wait for the right season to draw blood. I met Julian when I was 19. I had just finished my first year of college working as a file clerk at Harrison & Cross, one of the most prestigious law firms in Chicago. I wasn't a prodigy, but I was something much more dangerous. I was observant. While other girls my age were worrying about fraternity parties, I was learning how to read a balance sheet, how to spot a shell company, and how to keep my mouth shut while keeping my eyes wide open. Julian was 24 then. He walked into that firm like he already owned the building. He was charming, ambitious, and possessed a silver tongue that could sell ice to a polar bear. He talked about building a real estate empire that would redefine the Chicago skyline. He saw the world as a game of Monopoly, and he intended to buy every hotel on the board. He told me he was going to build something incredible. I told him I'd help him file the paperwork. Romance, right? It was a whirlwind of ambition and expensive dinners. We were married by the time I was 20. Our son, Leo, came a year later. In those early days, I was the one working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, while Julian networked. I was the one building my own savings, dollar by dollar into a 401k he didn't think twice about taking. My grandmother, a woman who lived through the Great Depression with nothing but a sewing machine and a sharp wit, said to me, "Elena, a woman should always have her own money. Not secret money, just her own, something the world can't touch." She was the smartest person I ever knew. By the time I was 23, Julian's big break finally happened. Sterling Crest was born. He asked me to quit the law firm and join him full-time. He said he needed someone he could trust completely to handle the books, the contractors, the frantic midnight calls from investors. so I became his unpaid everything. Officially, my title was wife. Unofficially, I was the chief operating officer, the lead bookkeeper, the crisis manager, the interior designer for every model home, and the person who made sure Julian didn't accidentally commit perjury once a week. I did it all while raising Leo, managing a household that looked like something out of a magazine, and keeping Julian fed, laundered, and ego-stroked. For 11 years, I poured my soul into his dream, and for 11 years, Julian took the credit. He stood on stages at industry galas, accepting awards for Visionary of the Year, thanking his mentors, his bankers, and his amazing team. He'd gesture vaguely to the table where I sat, calling me his beautiful support system, as if I were a decorative pillar rather than the person who had actually calculated the ROI on his last 3 acquisitions. Somewhere along the line, the power went to his head. He stopped asking for my advice and started giving me instructions. He started staying late for client meetings that smelled of expensive perfume and gin. He started criticizing the way I dressed, calling my style maternal instead of executive. He told me I lacked ambition. Imagine that. I was running his entire back-office infrastructure for free, keeping his life from spinning into chaos, and he thought I wasn't ambitious enough. The truth was, I had plenty of ambition. It was just focused on something he couldn't see. The bomb dropped 3 months ago, on a Tuesday evening. I was in the kitchen, making his favorite, braised short ribs, because I was still trying, like a fool, to fix a bridge that had already been burned. He sat me down at the marble kitchen island. He didn't look sad. He didn't look guilty. He looked like he was presiding over a corporate downsizing. "I want a divorce," he said, his voice flat and professional. "And Elena, I want the sterling name, the Chicago penthouse, the luxury cars, and the business. Everything. You can keep Leo." He said it with a shrug. "I'll take the assets, you take the kid." Like our 15-year-old son was a leftover piece of furniture he didn't have space for in his new life. I just stared at him. 15 years of my life, my sweat, and my silence ended between a salt shaker and a designer fruit bowl. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't find out until I started digging into the shadows, was that Julian had been planning it for a year. He had a high-priced lawyer, he had an exit strategy, and he had a replacement waiting in the wings. But Julian Sterling forgot the very first thing I learned at Harrison and Cross. In any deal, the person who holds the documents holds the power. And I had been holding the documents for a very long time.
Julian's announcement at the kitchen island wasn't just a request for a divorce. It was an eviction notice from a life I had built with my own bare hands. As he walked away that night, leaving his untouched dinner to go cold, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at the braised short ribs and realized I had spent 15 years nourishing a man who was now trying to starve me. To understand why Julian felt so entitled to everything, you have to understand the myth he created. In the glossy pages of Chicago Business Monthly, Julian Sterling was the self-made titan who turned a small loan into a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. But the magazine didn't mention the midnight sessions where I reconciled his chaotic ledgers. It didn't mention the 3 times I personally talked zoning board members out of shutting down his North Side developments. For over a decade, my official title was wife, but my reality was the shadow CEO. I was the one who managed the contractors who hated his arrogance. I was the one who drafted the investor pitches that he merely read off a teleprompter. While he was at the university club drinking 20-year-old scotch and networking, I was in our home office drowning in spreadsheets, making sure the interest on his massive loans didn't swallow us whole. But as the bank accounts grew, Julian's memory shrank. He began to believe his own press releases. The shift was subtle at first. A comment here about how I stayed at home while he battled in the trenches, a smirk there when I tried to discuss a new acquisition strategy, as if my input was a cute hobby he was humoring. Then came the gaslighting. He started criticizing my lack of ambition. He told me I had become stagnant, that I didn't understand the pressure of the modern market. Pressure? I was raising a son who barely saw his father, managing a 10,000 square foot household and running his back office operations for $0 an hour. But in Julian's world, unless you were the one holding the microphone at the gala, you weren't doing anything at all. Then, less than 24 hours after the Tuesday night massacre, the cavalry arrived. Or rather, the vulture. Elena Sterling, Julian's mother, appeared at my front door with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and a face so tight from Botox, it was a miracle she could blink. She didn't come to comfort me, she came to mark the territory. She sat in my living room, refusing the tea I offered, and looked at me with that practiced aristocratic pity that only old Chicago money can weaponize. "Elena, dear," she began, her voice like silk wrapped around a razor blade, "it's a tragedy, truly, but one must be realistic. Men like Julian, they have needs. They need a certain kind of energy. Perhaps if you had tried a bit harder to keep up, if you hadn't let yourself become so domestic." Domestic was the word she used for the woman who had kept her son out of bankruptcy twice. Evelyn's marriage advice was legendary, mostly because her own husband spent 300 days a year at his golf club in Florida just to avoid the sound of her voice. But here she was lecturing me on how to keep a man. She patted my hand, her diamond rings cold against my skin. "Julian has built a legacy, Elena. It would be selfish of you to try and dismantle it just because your feelings are hurt. Take a modest settlement, move to a nice suburb, and let him continue his work. It's for the best, for Leo's sake, really." For Leo's sake, the ultimate emotional blackmail. Leo, my 15-year-old son, was the only thing that kept my heart beating in that house. He was smart, observant, and possessed a quiet intensity that Julian mistook for weakness. Julian didn't see a son, he saw a brand extension. He wanted Leo to be a star athlete, a future mogul, a carbon copy of himself. But Leo saw through the cracks. He saw his father's late nights and my red eyes. And now Julian was telling Leo that mom is being difficult and dad just wants us all to be happy. The poison was being dripped into Leo's ear every single day, a slow-acting toxin designed to alienate him from the only person who actually knew him. By the end of that first week, I was a ghost in my own home. Julian moved me into the guest room, a small, drafty suite at the end of the hall. He started reclaiming the house. My walk-in closet was emptied, my clothes packed in literal garbage bags by a service Evelyn had hired. The message was loud and clear. You are an intruder in the empire of Sterling. The humiliation was a daily ritual. Julian would walk past the guest room door, talking loudly on his phone about exciting new chapters. He stopped using my name, referring to me only as his ex to anyone he called. He canceled my personal credit cards within 48 hours to separate the finances, he claimed, while he continued to spend thousands on vintage wine and bespoke suits. Everyone saw a woman who was drowning. My sister called me every day, sobbing, telling me to hire a shark and take him for every penny. My few remaining friends looked at me with that horrific, sad dog expression, as if I were already a social corpse. But here's the thing about being a ghost. People forget you're in the room. They talk freely in front of you. They leave their laptops unlocked. They leave their bank statements on the marble island. They assume that because you are silent, you are also stupid. What Julian didn't know, what even Evelyn in all her arrogance couldn't fathom, was that I had found something 3 years ago. It happened on a random rainy Tuesday, much like the one where he demanded a divorce. I was doing the year-end reconciliation for Sterling Crest, digging through a labyrinth of offshore transfers that Julian thought he had hidden behind a maze of shell companies. I followed the breadcrumbs. I followed them through encrypted files and hidden ledgers, and what I found didn't just break my heart, it set it on fire. Julian wasn't building a real estate empire. He was building a house of cards on a foundation of gasoline. And for the last 3 years, while he was calling me unambitious, I had been quietly, patiently documenting every single drop of fuel. I looked at the garbage bags filled with my clothes sitting in the guest room. I looked at the modest settlement offer Julian had left on the nightstand, a pittance that wouldn't even cover Leo's college tuition. And I smiled. "You want everything, Julian?" I whispered to the empty room. "Fine. I'm going to make sure you get exactly what you asked for."
The garbage bags were the first sign of the new regime. Black, plastic, and heavy with the weight of my past. Julian didn't just want me gone, he wanted to erase any evidence that I had ever existed in the Sterling Crest penthouse. But as painful as seeing my life packed like refuse was, it paled in comparison to the moment she walked through the door. Enter Maya Vance. She was 27 years old, a marketing consultant at Julian's firm, and the personification of everything Julian thought he deserved. She had that Instagram-perfect look, the blonde balayage, the vacuum-sealed yoga pants that cost more than my first car, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She didn't walk into my kitchen, she occupied it. I remember standing in the hallway of the guest wing when I saw her. She was wearing my grandmother's apron, the vintage floral one I'd worn every Sunday for a decade. She was using my high-end blender to make some neon green wellness smoothie, laughing at something Julian said as he stood behind her, his hands on her waist. He didn't even look up when I passed by. I was a ghost, a piece of old furniture waiting for the moving van. "Julian, honey," Maya's voice was a sugary trill that made my skin crawl. "We really need to redo the lighting in here. It's so traditional. It lacks vitality." "Whatever you want, babe," Julian replied. His voice held a warmth he hadn't used with me since the first year of our marriage. "The old energy is out. It's your house now." They didn't just share a bed, they shared a campaign of psychological warfare. Julian paraded Maya through the penthouse like a trophy, making sure I saw every kiss, every whisper, every new chapter post on social media. He'd tag her in photos at our favorite restaurants with captions like, "Finally found someone who matches my ambition, #blessed, new beginnings." The humiliation was calculated. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to scream or throw a vase so he could call his lawyer and claim I was emotionally unstable. But I gave him nothing but a blank stare and a polite nod. Inside, I was a furnace of rage, but outside, I was a sheet of ice. Through all of this, I had one lifeline, or so I thought. Harper Davis had been my best friend since high school. We had survived bad boyfriends, the terrifying first years of motherhood, and the chaotic rise of Julian's business together. She was the first person I called when Julian dropped the bomb. She was the one who brought over wine and let me sob on her shoulder for 3 hours. "He's a monster, Elle," she'd told me, her eyes brimming with tears of sympathy. "You deserve so much better. Take him for everything. Don't let him get away with this." She was my confidant. I told her everything. I told her I was thinking about fighting for the lakefront property. I told her I was looking at apartments in the Gold Coast. I told her about the secret documents I'd been gathering, though thankfully I kept the specific details of the debt to myself. But then the coincidences started becoming too frequent to ignore. Julian would mention things in passing that I had only told Harper. When I mentioned to Harper that I was planning to take Leo to a trip to visit my sister in Seattle to get him away from the drama, Julian blocked the trip the very next day, claiming it was an interference with his parental time. When I told Harper I was looking at a specific boutique law firm for representation, Julian's lawyer filed a preemptive motion that blocked that firm due to a conflict of interest I hadn't even known existed. The realization didn't come in a flash. It was a slow, sickening dawning. I was at Harper's house, sitting on her expensive velvet sofa when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She was in the kitchen, pouring us more wine. I shouldn't have looked, but the notification was a text from Julian. JS. She's suspicious. Keep her talking. Tell me if she mentions the offshore accounts again. Dinner Friday? The room tilted. My heart didn't just break, it hardened into a diamond. My best friend of 20 years wasn't just a shoulder to cry on, she was a spy. She had been feeding Julian my plans, my fears, and my strategies in exchange for what? A seat at the table? A chance to be close to the Titan of Sterling Crest? Maybe she thought she'd be the one to replace Maya once the divorce was final. Julian always did like to have a backup plan. I didn't confront her. I couldn't, not yet. I realized then that I was playing a game where the board was rigged and the referee was on the payroll. Julian had his mother, his mistress, and my best friend in his pocket. He thought he had me surrounded. What he didn't realize is that when you surround someone, you also give them a target in every direction. The worst part of the betrayal wasn't the loss of a friend, it was the effect on Leo. My son was retreating into himself. He saw Maya in my kitchen, wearing my clothes. He saw Julian ignoring me, and he saw me, the woman who used to be his rock, shrinking into a guest room. Julian was working on him, too. Your mom is just bitter, Leo, I overheard him say one night. She's trying to take money that belongs to the company. She's trying to ruin our future because she can't handle the fact that I've moved on. Leo looked at me that night, his eyes filled with confusion that broke my heart. He didn't know who to believe, and Julian was a master of the narrative. He was the builder, the provider, the hero. I was just the woman in the guest room who lacked ambition. That was the night I stopped being a victim and became a predator. I called Victoria Grant, a lawyer I had met through my old firm, Harrison and Cross. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a forensic accountant with a law degree and a heart made of cold-rolled steel. Victoria, I said, my voice finally steady, I don't want a fair settlement. I want him to have exactly what he's been building for 15 years. I want him to have every single brick. Elena, Victoria replied, her voice low and dangerous. If we do this your way, you're going to have to play the part of the broken wife until the very last second. You can't flinch, you can't fight back. You have to let him think he's crushed you. I've been practicing for 15 years, I said. I'm ready.
3 years. That's how long I'd been carrying the weight of a truth that would have paralyzed a lesser woman. 3 years of sitting across the breakfast table from a man who acted like he owned the sun, while I knew he couldn't even afford the light bulbs in our kitchen. It started on a Tuesday night. Always Tuesdays, it seems. 3 years before Julian sat me at the kitchen island to demand a divorce. He was out closing a deal, which I now know meant he was likely in a hotel suite with Maya. I was in our home office, reconciling the books for Sterling Crest. I've always been good with numbers. Numbers don't lie, they don't cheat, they don't have egos. And that night, the numbers were screaming at me. I found a transfer I didn't recognize, then another, a trail of breadcrumbs leading away from our operational accounts into a labyrinth of offshore entities and high-risk investment platforms. I stayed up until the Chicago skyline began to glow with the first light of dawn, digging through 3 years of hidden ledgers. What I found made the blood in my veins turn to slush. Julian Sterling, the visionary of the year, had been bleeding us dry. He had taken out a second mortgage on our Lakeshore Drive penthouse 4 years ago for $500,000, then a third mortgage 2 years later for another $500,000. Total owed on a home the world thought we owned outright? $1.5 million. The actual market value in a cooling Chicago market? Barely $1.2 million. We were underwater on our own home by $300,000. But that was just the appetizer. The business, Sterling Crest, was a hollowed-out shell. Julian had maxed out every line of credit to the tune of $400,000. He owed $150,000 in back taxes that he'd been deferring through creative accounting. There were unpaid vendor debts of $200,000 and equipment loans for projects that hadn't even broken ground. And where had the money gone? I tracked it. $250,000 lost in a reckless cryptocurrency pump and dump scheme, $100,000 in gambling debts from high-stakes poker games at a private club in the Loop, and the most galling discovery, a secret apartment in River North, rented and furnished for $80,000 over 2 years, an apartment for his consultant, Maya Vance. The Sterling Empire was a $2.5 million hole dressed up in a bespoke suit. We didn't own the Penthouse. We didn't own the fleet of luxury SUVs. We didn't even own the furniture Maya was so eager to redecorate. We just had very expensive monthly obligations and a mountain of debt that was one bad quarter away from a landslide. My first instinct was to walk into our bedroom, wake him up, and scream. I wanted to demand to know how he could gamble with our son's future. I wanted to throw the laptop at his smug, sleeping face. But I stopped. I remembered my grandmother's voice. "Elena, never show your hand until the pot is at its peak." If I confronted him then, he would have manipulated me. He would have used his silver tongue to explain it away. Or worse, he would have found a way to drain my separate assets to cover his tracks. See, Julian thought I was unambitious because I didn't crave the spotlight. What he forgot was that I had been working since I was 18. I had my own IRA from my years at Harrison and Cross, which I had aggressively managed and grown to $200,000. And then there was Grandma's legacy. When she passed away, she left me $500,000. Not in a joint account, not in a fund Julian could touch. She left it to me with a note that said, "For the rainy day, Elena. Chicago weather is unpredictable." I had $700,000 that was legally, purely, separately mine. So I didn't scream. Instead, I went to war in silence. Over the next 3 years, I worked with my uncle, a retired forensic accountant who hated Julian's guts, to create an irrevocable trust for Leo. I moved my IRA and my inheritance into that trust. I made sure my name wasn't even on it as a beneficiary. It was for Leo's education, his first home, his safety net. It was a vault that no creditor, no bankruptcy court, and certainly no Julian Sterling could ever crack open. Then I documented everything, every secret loan, every missed tax payment, every cent spent on Maya. I made digital copies, physical copies, and kept them in a safety deposit box that only I had the key to. For 3 years, I played the part. I smiled at the galas, I nodded when he bragged about his success. I even let him criticize my lack of drive while I was secretly managing a $2.5 million financial disaster and securing my son's life. I was the bookkeeper for a sinking ship, and I was the only one who had already built a lifeboat. When Julian finally demanded the divorce, when he stood there in our kitchen and told me he wanted everything, the house, the business, the cars, I almost had to choke back a laugh. He thought he was taking the gold mine and leaving me with the dirt. He didn't realize he was demanding the debt and leaving me with the freedom. He wanted the Sterling name? Fine, he could have the lawsuits that came with it. He wanted the penthouse? Great, he could have the 3 mortgages and the looming foreclosure notice I knew was coming in 6 months. He wanted the assets? He was actually asking for an avalanche, and I was more than happy to step out of the way. But before the final blow, I had to survive the mediation. I had to let him think he was winning. I had to let him see me break. Because a man like Julian Sterling only stops looking for traps when he thinks his enemy is already destroyed.
The next 3 months were a masterclass in artifice. If life were a movie, I would have won an Oscar, a Golden Globe, and every other trophy on the shelf. I became exactly what Julian, Evelyn, and Harper expected me to be. Broken, defeated, and barely holding on by a thread. I showed up to the mediation sessions at the high-rise offices in the Loop with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. I wore outfits that were slightly too large for me, making me look frail, like a woman who had forgotten how to eat. I spoke in a soft, hesitant voice, often letting Victoria Grant, my lawyer, shush me as if I were too fragile to handle the conversation. Julian sat across from me, radiating a toxic level of triumph. He wore a new $20,000 Patek Philippe watch, bought with money he didn't have, and adjusted his French cuffs with the smugness of a man who had already won the lottery. "I'm not trying to be difficult," I whispered during our second mediation session, dabbing at my eyes with a tissue. "I know Sterling Crest is Julian's life's work. I know the Penthouse is his pride and joy. I don't want to tear our family apart more than it already is. I just want enough to start over." I requested a settlement that was, quite frankly, insulting. $50,000 in cash, my personal belongings, and shared custody of Leo. That was it. No alimony, no claim to the business, no share of the Lakeshore Drive property. Julian's lawyer, Arthur Vance, looked at the proposal and then at me. Even a shark like him felt a flicker of confusion. "Mrs. Thorne, you realize you're entitled to significantly more. Under Illinois law, marital assets are subject to—" "I don't care about the law," I cut him off, my voice cracking perfectly. "I just want peace. I want him to be happy." Julian leaned back, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He thought I was a wounded animal he was graciously putting out of its misery. He probably thought his gaslighting had worked so well that I truly believed I was worthless without him. "We accept," Julian said, before his lawyer could even blink. "I think that's very fair, Elena. It shows you've finally gained some perspective." Perspective. That was one way to put it. With each passing week, Julian's arrogance grew into a monstrous thing. He stopped being careful. He stopped pretending to be the reasonable one. He started telling everyone at the Chicago Yacht Club that I hadn't even fought. She just folded, I heard through the grapevine, via Harper, of course. I offered her a bone and she ran off to her little apartment with her tail between her legs. Even Evelyn got in on the celebration. She hosted a pre-divorce cocktail party where she bragged to her socialite friends that girl didn't get a dime. "Julian is keeping the empire intact," she told them. "It takes a Sterling to run a Sterling business after all." Meanwhile, Maya Vance had already begun redecorating the penthouse. She was spending money Julian didn't have like it was water from a fountain. She replaced my handcrafted Italian dining table with a piece of modern art that looked like a slab of gray concrete. She even painted over the nursery I had hand-painted for Leo, a beautiful mural of the Chicago skyline with a flat, industrial gray. Everything was turning gray, just like her future. But while they were picking out new curtains for a sinking ship, Victoria and I were refining the poetry. Legal documents are like poetry, boring, expensive poetry that can ruin a man's life if he doesn't read the footnotes. The main divorce agreement stated clearly that I was relinquishing all claims to marital property. The penthouse, the business, the vehicles, everything would go to Julian. But attached to that agreement was an addendum, the liability disclosure statement. In clear, black and white legal language, it stated that by assuming sole ownership of all marital assets, the respondent, Julian, was also assuming sole and exclusive personal liability for all encumbrances, liens, mortgages, and debts associated with said assets. Julian was so blinded by the gold that he didn't see the lead tied to it. 2 weeks before the final hearing, Arthur Vance actually grew a conscience. He called Victoria. "My client is assuming significant assets," Arthur said. "I'd like to request a full financial audit before we finalize, just to verify the valuations." Victoria kept her voice neutral, the way a lioness keeps her tail still before a pounce. "Of course, we'll provide whatever documentation you need, but my client is eager to close. If we delay for an audit, we may have to revisit the alimony waiver." When Arthur brought this to Julian, my soon-to-be ex-husband, shut it down immediately. "No audits," Julian told him. "I know because Victoria recorded the call, legal in the context of settlement negotiations. I built Sterling Crest. I know what it's worth. I'm not paying $50,000 to an accountant to tell me I'm rich. Maya wants the renovation finished by next month. Just sign the damn papers."
Julian even signed a waiver against his own counsel's advice, stating that he was declining a full financial disclosure and audit. He signed it without reading it. He signed it because he was impatient, because he was arrogant, and because Maya was whispering in his ear about a summer in the south of France. Never underestimate the power of an impatient mistress to make a man skip the fine print. The night before the hearing, Julian sent me a text. J.S. Thank you for being smart about this, Elena. You're finally acting like the woman I thought you were. I'll make sure Leo has everything he needs. I stared at the message. 15 years of my life, and he was thanking me for not being a problem while he threw me out like old trash. He didn't even realize that he was the one who had been disposed of. I didn't reply. I just looked at Leo, who was sitting at our small kitchen table in the 2-bedroom apartment I'd rented. He was doing his homework, his face serious. "Mom," he asked, looking up, "is it going to be okay tomorrow?" I walked over and kissed the top of his head. "Tomorrow, Leo, the weight finally shifts. We're going to be just fine." I had been ready for 3 years. I had been ready for 15 years. And as the sun set over the cold waters of Lake Michigan, I knew that tomorrow Julian Sterling would finally get everything he ever wanted, and it would be the heaviest thing he ever carried.
I remember every microscopic detail of that morning. The way the pale Chicago sunlight filtered through the tall, dusty windows, the sterile smell of floor polish and old paper, the quiet, rhythmic shuffling of files by the court clerk. This was the place where 15 years of marriage would officially be cremated. Julian arrived first. He strode in like he was walking into a board meeting at Sterling Crest. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal Armani I had helped him pick out for a client gala 3 years ago. His new Patek Philippe watch caught the light as he shook hands with Arthur Vance. He looked radiant, confident, the picture of a man who had successfully traded an outdated wife for a newer, shinier life. Maya was waiting in the hallway. She wasn't allowed in the courtroom, but she wanted to be there for the victory lap. I caught a glimpse of her through the glass door, checking her reflection in her phone, smoothing her designer dress, already spending the money she thought was coming her way. Even Evelyn Sterling was there, sitting in the front row of the gallery like she was attending a coronation. She gave me a look of pure, icy triumph when I walked in, a look that said, "I told you that you weren't enough for him." I arrived a few minutes late. I wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry, and my hair pulled back in a low, tight bun. I kept my head down, my shoulders slightly slumped. I looked like a woman who had spent the night crying. I looked like a woman who had nothing left to lose. I was the image of total defeat. It was my best performance yet. Judge Patricia Holden took the bench. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the bridge of a nose that had seen every lie, every scam, and every tragedy Chicago had to offer. She didn't look for drama. She looked for the law. Mercer versus Mercer, Sterling versus Thorne, the judge corrected herself, peering at the file. Final dissolution hearing. I understand the parties have reached an agreement? Arthur Vance stood up, his voice booming with confidence. "Yes, Your Honor. My client, Julian Sterling, is assuming all marital assets, including the family residence on Lakeshore Drive, the real estate development firm Sterling Crest, and all associated luxury vehicles. In exchange, Mrs. Thorne receives a cash settlement of $50,000 and personal effects." Victoria Grant rose beside me, her voice calm and professional. "That is correct, Your Honor. My client agrees to relinquish all claims to these assets and accepts the proposed settlement terms." Judge Holden's eyes moved to me. She studied my face for a long moment, likely looking for signs of coercion. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle, "I need to confirm that you understand what you are agreeing to today. You are giving up your claim to substantial property you helped build over 15 years. Are you certain this is what you want?" I looked up, my voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand. I just want my husband to have everything he asked for. I want this to be over." "Very well," the judge sighed, clearly thinking I was making a terrible mistake. "Let's proceed with the signing." The clerk distributed the final documents, page after page of dense legal jargon. Julian signed eagerly, his pen flying across the paper. He didn't even look at the pages. He just wanted to get to the end. He wanted the keys. He wanted the win. I signed slowly, deliberately. Every stroke of my pen felt like a weight being lifted. Across the courtroom, Julian glanced at his mother and winked. He was so smug he was practically vibrating. Meanwhile, Arthur Vance was doing what good lawyers do, reviewing the complete document package one last time before the judge signed off. Main agreement? Signed. Asset schedule? Signed. Settlement terms? Signed. Then Arthur reached the addendum, the liability disclosure statement. I watched his face. I watched the casual confidence flicker and die. I watched his eyes widen behind his glasses. He flipped back a page, then forward again, his lips moving as he did the math in his head. His face went the color of a dead fish. He leaned toward Julian, whispering urgently, "Julian, we need to talk, now." Julian waved him off, still basking in his imaginary glory. "Not now, Arthur. We're almost done. Let's get to the celebratory lunch." "Julian," Arthur's voice was harsh, panicked whisper, "you're assuming the debt, all of it." Julian turned, his brow furrowing. "What? What are you talking about? The assets are—" "The liability disclosure," Arthur hissed, pointing at the page Julian just signed. "The 3 mortgages on the Penthouse, $1.5 million, the business lines of credit, $400,000, the back taxes, the vendor liens. Julian, you just signed for $2.5 million in personal liability against assets that are barely worth half that." The silence that followed was deafening. The color didn't just leave Julian's face, it evacuated. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized there was no parachute. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor. "Wait, this isn't right. This is fraud. She hid this." Judge Holden's gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. "Mr. Sterling, sit down." "She manipulated the numbers," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I didn't agree to this. I wanted the assets." "Mr. Sterling," the judge's voice was like a blade, "I am looking at a liability disclosure statement that was attached to your agreement, an agreement you signed. These are debts associated with the assets you claimed, mortgages on your residence, loans for your business. Are you telling this court that you didn't know your own financial situation?" Julian was speechless. He looked at Arthur, but Arthur was already looking at the floor.
The collapse didn't happen in a single explosion. It was a series of rapid, sickening thuds. The first thud was my advance. As I mentioned, she didn't even wait for Julian to leave the courtroom. By the time Julian fought his way through the shock and the panic to get back to the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, Maya was already gone. She hadn't just moved out, she had performed a surgical extraction. She took the designer luggage she'd bought on Julian's maxed-out credit cards, her jewelry, and even a few pieces of high-end art she thought she could pawn. She left a note on the gray concrete dining table, the one she had replaced my furniture with. It was short, cold, and utterly Maya. "This isn't what I signed up for, Julian. I'm a consultant, not a charity worker. Don't call me." Julian had traded a 15-year partnership for a woman who viewed him as a temporary ATM. The new energy he had bragged about had a very short battery life when the power was cut. The second thud was the bank. Within 30 days of the divorce being finalized, the first foreclosure notice arrived for the Penthouse. Julian tried to sell it, but the Chicago real estate market had shifted. Prospective buyers walked through the rooms Maya had painted industrial gray and felt the coldness. When they ran the title search, they saw the 3 mortgages. They saw the liens. The house was a financial radioactive zone. Julian was forced to do a short sale, losing every cent of equity and still owing the bank a deficiency judgment. The man who wanted the empire was now living in a studio apartment in a part of the city he used to mock. The third thud was Sterling Crest.
Without my quiet management of the books, the house of cards folded in the wind. Vendors who hadn't been paid in months filed lawsuits. The $400,000 line of credit was frozen by the bank the moment they saw the divorce settlement's debt disclosure. Julian tried to network his way out of it at the Chicago Yacht Club, but the news of his bankruptcy had traveled faster than a Lake Michigan gale. In the high-stakes circles of the Chicago elite, bankrupt is a contagious disease. People who used to laugh at his jokes now suddenly found themselves very busy when they saw him coming. His phone, which used to buzz every 30 seconds, went silent. Even the golf club memberships were revoked when the monthly dues bounced. Then there was Elena Sterling. My mother-in-law, the woman who lived for the Sterling legacy, found herself in the middle of a social nightmare. Her son was a pariah. Her family name was synonymous with fraud and failure. At her bridge club in the Gold Coast, the other women stopped asking about Julian and started whispering when she left the room. She tried to call me once, about 6 weeks after the court date. Her voice was trembling, stripped of its aristocratic arrogance. "Elena," she said, her tone almost pleading, "we need to talk. Julian he's in a bad way. The stress is too much. Surely you can help. You were always the one who knew how to handle the finances. For the sake of the family name." "The family name, Evelyn?" I interrupted, sitting in my new, sun-drenched office. "The name you told me I wasn't worthy of. The name you said Julian needed better energy to maintain. I'm afraid I'm no longer in the business of saving Sterlings. I'm too busy building Thorne." I hung up before she could respond. It was the shortest conversation we'd had in 15 years, and the most satisfying. But the betrayal that needed the final closure was Harper. My best friend tried to reach out about a month after the truth came out. She sent a long, rambling email filled with excuses. She claimed she was under Julian's spell, that he had manipulated her, and that she had only fed him information because she thought she was protecting me. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't need to. I simply blocked her on everything. True friendship isn't a commodity you can trade when the market gets tough. She had chosen her side, and now she had to live on it. I heard later that she tried to get close to Julian in his studio apartment, thinking she could be his savior, but Julian, in his bitterness, blamed her for not seeing the trap. They deserved each other, two ghosts haunting the ruins of a lie. The most important resolution, however, was with Leo. My son watched the collapse from the safety of our new life. He saw his father's Titan mask crumble. He saw the way Julian had prioritized the empire over him, and he saw me, the woman who had quietly, patiently ensured that his college fund and his future were protected in a vault no one could touch. One evening, we were sitting in our new kitchen. I was painting a small canvas, a hobby I'd finally returned to. Leo was looking at the court documents I'd kept in a folder, the ones that detailed the debt Julian had assumed. "You knew," he said quietly, looking at me with eyes that were older than his 15 years. "You knew he was broke for 3 years. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were a child, Leo," I said, putting down my brush, "and because I wanted you to see your father for who he really was, not who I told him he was. I wanted you to see that a real man doesn't build a life on lies and debt. A real man protects the people he loves." Leo was quiet for a long time. Then he walked over and hugged me. It wasn't the polite, distant hug of a teenager. It was the hug of a son who finally understood that his mother hadn't given up. She had been the only one fighting the real war all along. Julian tried to come by once. It was a rainy Tuesday, fittingly. He looked 10 years older. His Armani suit was wrinkled and his expensive watch was gone, replaced by a cheap plastic one. He stood in the hallway of my new apartment building, looking like a beggar at the gates of a city he used to rule. "Can we just talk, Elle?" he asked, his voice cracked. "I made mistakes, I know that, but the debt, it's too much. I'm going to lose everything. If you could just lend me some of the trust money, just to get Sterling Crest back on its feet." I leaned against the doorframe, looking at the man I had once thought was my world. "You told me you wanted everything, Julian, and I gave it to you. You have the name, you have the business, you have the debt. You wanted to be the king. Well, heavy is the head that wears the crown." "I have nothing," he shouted, his old temper flooring for a second before dying into a whimper. "No, Julian," I said, slowly closing the door. You have exactly what you built. I just stopped holding it up for you."
6 months after the gavel came down in courtroom 4B, I found myself standing in the middle of a sun-drenched studio in the West Loop of Chicago. The walls were painted a soft, calming shade of sage green, the color of new growth, the color of hope. Above the door, a simple, elegant brass sign read, "Thorne Interiors." I didn't have a corporate fleet of SUVs or a 3-story penthouse anymore. I had a 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen that worked and a son who laughed again. And for the first time in 15 years, when I looked at a balance sheet, I didn't see lies. I saw a future I had earned, dollar by dollar, choice by choice. My first real client was a woman named Sandra. She was 52 years old, and like me, she had just walked away from a long marriage that had slowly hollowed her out. She stood in her new, empty condo, looking lost. "I don't even know what my style is," she told me, her voice trembling. "For 28 years, I just picked what he liked. I don't know who I am in this space." I walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. "We aren't just picking furniture, Sandra. We're reclaiming your territory. We start with one room, one color, one day at a time. We build a place where you don't have to be invisible anymore." As I worked with her, I realized I wasn't just an interior designer. I was a transition architect. I was helping women build the lifeboats I had spent 3 years designing for myself. Business took off faster than I ever imagined. Word traveled through the Chicago grapevine, not as the discarded Sterling wife, but as the woman with the iron will and the impeccable eye. I wasn't Julian's support system anymore. I was Elena Thorne, and my ambition was finally being fed. And Julian? I heard he eventually declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The Sterling crest name was bought for pennies by a larger development firm. The Penthouse was sold at auction. Every once in a while, someone would mention seeing him at a mid-tier bar trying to sell consulting services to anyone who would listen to his stories of the good old days. He still blames me, of course. In his mind, I am the villain who stole his empire. He still can't grasp the fact that you can't steal something that was already built on air. I didn't take his money, I just stopped paying his debts. There's a profound difference between the two. One Sunday morning, Leo and I were walking along the lakefront. The Chicago wind was brisk, but the sun was warm on our faces. Leo was talking about his college applications. He wanted to study architecture, but the real kind, the kind that builds things meant to last. "Mom," he said, stopping to look out at the water, "are you happy?" I looked at him, my son, who was now taller than me, who carried his grandmother's wisdom and his own strength. I thought about the garbage bags, the gray kitchen, the betrayal of Harper, and the 3 years of silent warfare. "I'm free, Leo," I said, "and in this world, freedom is the highest form of happiness." "I'm glad you didn't just take the $50,000 and run," he smiled. "I'm glad you made him take his own mess." I laughed, a real deep laugh that echoed across the shore. "Well, Leo, like your great-grandmother used to say, if you're going to give a man everything he asked for, make sure it's heavy enough to keep him humble." I haven't seen Evelyn or Harper since that day. I don't wish them ill, I simply don't wish for them at all. They were characters in a story I finished reading a long time ago. As I sit in my sage green kitchen tonight, looking at my grandmother's recipe box, I realize the long game isn't about the win. It's about the person you become while you're waiting for the board to clear. It's about the patience to let an arrogant man dig his own hole and the strength to not jump in to save him. Music. The piano swells into a powerful, inspiring crescendo, then fades into a low, steady beat. Voiceover. Elena Thorne's story is more than a tale of revenge. It is a reminder to every person who feels invisible, every person whose labor is unappreciated, and every person being told they lack ambition by the very people draining their soul. Here are the lessons from Revenge Stories 101. First, knowledge is the only currency that never devalues. Elena didn't win because she was lucky. She won because she knew the numbers. Never delegate your financial safety to someone else's ego.
Second, silence is not a weakness, it is a tactical advantage. While Julian was shouting his success from the rooftops, Elena was documenting the truth in the basement. Let them talk, let them brag. Your work in the dark will eventually bring their house down. And finally, your worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Julian Sterling thought Elena was a discarded asset. He didn't realize she was the foundation. When the foundation walks away, the building falls. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to play the long game to reclaim your life, tell us your story in the comments. We read every single one. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to Revenge Stories 101, and share this with someone who needs to know that it's never too late to start their own new chapter. Until next time, remember, keep your heart kind, but keep your books better.